Welcome to Solution Focused Future. I'm Joe George. We are here today with Emma Burns and David Hains. And Emma coming from New Zealand, David coming from Australia. David is the president of the Australasian Solution Focused Association, and Emma is the vice president. And my question is, how do you two like to be introduced?
For me, I'm a mental health nurse. I'm currently working in a youth agency. So we see people from age 12 to 26. And my main job here is doing single session therapy. So I see people at the point of entry into the service, and we decided that we'd get rid of the assessment and triage kind of process. And everybody just comes in and sees me for single session therapy. And some of those, that's all they need, whereas others will choose to go on and see someone on a regular basis. So I do that 3 days a week, and on the other days I'm running a small business where I do a little bit of teaching solution-focused approaches. And in my spare time, I help out the association in Australasia.
In my day job, which is with the police, and in my private work, which is a bit of counselling, a bit of delivering suicide prevention training, particularly to the general public. So just free workshops so that our general public can have some confidence and tools to use if they're worried about somebody.
For your general approach and love of this, why solution-focused therapy?
For me, so I trained as a psychologist, and the approaches I was taught were primarily CBT, but also a bit of everything else. And I never really felt comfortable with it. I think because those approaches, how I was taught anyway, was a really hierarchical kind of relationship that you build with a client. When I first came across Solution Focused in 2011, it just resonated with me because I remember clearly one of my first reactions, I suppose, being, wow, this is how I want to be with people. It was just really respectful and honouring people's strengths and who they were as a person, rather than, oh, I'm this guru who's going to come and tell you how to fix your life up. And so it was just a breath of fresh air for me, and that was the turning point.
Yeah, for me, as a mental health nurse, I spent nearly 20 years working in large hospitals in the emergency department. And when I first started there, I was working with a social worker named John, who introduced the idea of doing therapy or counselling in an emergency department. Because up until then, emergency departments were about doing an assessment and then referring them to somewhere, whether it was an inpatient or an outpatient setting. And John introduced the idea of doing therapy, and he was starting to run counselling in the emergency department. And so a few years later, I was in another hospital thinking about how to make my job more interesting and more effective. And at the time, I was just doing a lot of assessment, working with a really, really good team. We tried to do the best we could, but it was predominantly assessment. And when I started to look into it a little bit more, I started to get a bit curious about brief therapy and how we could do really effective brief therapy in only one session. And just looking into that, I stumbled across solution-focused approach, and I thought it's not exactly what I do, but it really interested me. I thought it aligns with what I'd like to do, helping people to leave the emergency department better than when they arrived. So I always say people don't come to the ED because they're having a good day. They come because they're having a bad day. And I need to get them to leave the department in a better state than when they arrived. And I know I won't do that from doing an assessment. So I started to do a little bit of solution-focused work, and it seemed to work. Now I've completely left the hospital system.
Do you use solution-focused thinking in your own lives?
I can't help it. I mean, it just is how I naturally think now, which is a real big shift for me, because I was a complete glass half empty person. I was a real pessimist. I always looked at what could go wrong. And so over time, I think just radically changed how I see the world and how I think about challenges in my own life, or how I particularly support my kids and my friends through hard times, and how they, for all their moaning about, oh my God, Mum, your questions, they use it with their friends. And even I've noticed recently, my family's been going through a bit of a rough patch recently, and noticed that the kids have started thinking about their own journey forward and with some of those concepts, which has been really cool to see. So they've really kind of adopted it as well, and use it to really make a difference for their friends who are going through tough times, which is really nice, because then they can feel like they're making a difference for the people in their lives who are important to them.
I like to think that I do, and I like to think that I look at the world in a solution focused way. I look at people's strengths rather than deficits. But I must be doing it somewhere, because my daughter Hannah recently had a Zoom conversation with a friend of ours, Sophie Geisler, in Mexico. Sophie's really keen, solution-focused clinician, therapist, person. And my daughter Hannah really loves hearing stories about Sophie. So I put them together, and they've met in Adelaide a couple of years ago. And so Hannah called up Sophie, and they had this conversation. And a couple of days later, I said to Hannah, how did it go? And she said, oh, it was really good, but she just kept asking me all these solution-focused questions, and it was the same stuff that you ask me all the time. Drives me nuts. I just wanted to have a normal conversation with her. So I figure that I must be like that at home enough that she knows what a solution-focused conversation is, because Sophie just hit her with it.
Everybody brings with them their own experiences into their practice. What were your theoretical approaches before you looked into solution-focused brief therapy, and how does it influence your current practice?
I think, well, I did my master's in CBT, so that was a really strong orientation that I fell back on. I was, prior to learning solution focus, quite interested in schema therapy. I found that quite interesting, but yeah, I mean, I still find those things interesting, but I feel like they require a whole bunch of expertise as such, and not that solution focused is not an expert. You don't need expertise to do it. I think I find using it much more relaxing than having to think about theories and models and processes. And I think because solution focused to me feels just like a conversation, it doesn't feel like a therapy session or a coaching session, or that the other person is having to follow some kind of predetermined script. And so that was my past. And I enjoyed my work, but I wouldn't go back to those models for all the money in the world now.
One of the keys to nursing, and particularly mental health nursing, is to do with the therapeutic relationship. We know that if you've got a good quality therapeutic engagement and relationship that you have with your client, you can do almost anything. It's a key. So I know that if I've got a good therapeutic relationship with my client, their diabetes will be managed better, because for a whole lot of reasons, it's not about the diabetes treatment, but they trust me. They will learn from me. They will listen to me. We'll have a much better conversation because we've got a better relationship, and that will flow on to the other things in their life. And as we were always taught, that your therapeutic relationship is the number one tool that you have as a nurse. And I think solution focused comes into that a lot, because we try to avoid the power differentials between, I'm the expert and you're the victim, or you're the client and you have to do what I say and listen to me because I've got all the knowledge. And as a nurse, I've never really been interested in taking that stance. And that was kind of highlighted to me a long time ago, when I thought I'd invented this thing, which later I found out was called the not knowing stance. Someone else invented it before me and probably wrote a book and made money from it. But I was working in the emergency department, and someone came in and they had so many problems. It just looked so bigger every time they opened their mouth, the accommodation and money and relationships and, sleeping in their car and lost their job and girlfriend was going to leave and all these complicated things, and had absolutely no idea what to do. And they came into the emergency department and I'm standing there with my badge on, and my badge, hospital employee, expert, sort of thing. I've come to you, you're going to fix all my problems. And he looked me in the eye and he said, I don't know what I should do. Tell me, what should I do? And for a split second, I'm thinking in my head, I don't know what you could do. How am I? They didn't teach me this at university. These problems are so big and so complicated, and you want me to tell you what to do about it? But then I just, in a split second, what am I going to say that's not going to make me look like an idiot? And I just said, look, mate, I don't know. That sounds pretty complicated, but what do you think's the first thing that you should do? And he thought about it for a second and he said, oh, maybe I should do this. I said, okay, well, what happens if you do this? What's going to happen? He said, well, if I do this, then this, and this is going to happen. And suddenly he had all the answers. And I thought, oh, that's fantastic. I'm off the hook. And he actually started to solve his own problem with me having absolutely no idea. But I think there was something in that relationship and something in the conversation where I handed over the power to him to make some decisions. And that was well before I did anything solution focused. But I thought it really sits with me because we need to empower people to make decisions. We need to show them that they're competent in making these decisions, and we need them to experience their own competency. And that will lead to confidence in being able to do things in the future. And I think that's one of the keys in any sort of therapy that we're doing.
What are the 3 most important things people should master to use solution-focused thinking?
One of the first things I think would be humility. And while that's not a technique as such, I think, there's those of us who can't wait to get rid of the expert label, but then there's people who really are attached to it. And so I think that would be a really big, important thing to learn in terms of being comfortable with not being the person who takes the credit for the person's success. So that would be the first thing for me. I think the things that I learned are not really techniques or skills so much. They're probably just the ways of thinking. And so humility, optimism for that person, and for that confidence, that the belief that the conversation can make a really big difference for people. And I guess passion and enthusiasm, because I just love the work I do. It's given me a huge love of people. I just love, not everybody in the world, but I love most people. And it's given me an energy and a desire to interact with people.
For me, some of the things I've already said about not knowing stance, I think is very important. And about the relationship, I don't think that this is talked about enough in solution-focused world and training and things, about the relationship between the person. I think too many people talk about the conversation, but not enough people talk about the relationship. And also the listening part of the relationship. I remember first year nursing, a Japanese student said to me that really important that we remember that we've got 2 ears but only 1 mouth, and we should use those in proportion. And I think a big part of the solution-focused approach is listening. We need to be able to listen, and I think our stance of not being the expert, because the expert, we tend to tell people what to do. Whereas as a listener, it's more important to listen for both what they want, what they want now, what they want in the future, that future focus, and listening for strengths and resources and hopes and desires, because these are the things that are the key for helping the person to get to the future. No point listening to their deficits and problems and all the things that brought them here from a deficit perspective, we need to be listening for their strengths and their resources and the things that are still working, and the way that they've been able to get through so far. And these are the tools that we need to highlight and mobilize to get people to the future that they want to be.
What fields beyond counseling and mental health in general do you feel best align with solution-focused thinking?
It's probably harder to think of what doesn't. I was reading something yesterday in the coaching space, because I'm working on some coaching stuff at the moment. And so obviously coaching is a really big field. I've yet to read the article, but it was an article around how solution-focused coaching was really effective in teaching golf. So, I think the number of places and settings that can be used is probably almost endless. Parenting is, a big, I think anything interactional, how can it not benefit from this kind of way of interacting?
Yeah, I kind of think the same, where people want something to be better, but they don't quite know how to go about doing that. And in particular, they want something to be better in the perspective of a relationship, where other people are involved. I've been looking at a couple of things the last couple of days. I agree with Emma that it's probably, it'd be easier to list the things where I don't think it would work. But lately I've been talking to a couple of people. One of them is a colleague here I work with, and we're talking about using it in drama and doing drama workshops, talking about mental health and kind of coaching and being good people. So we're trying to work out something to do there. And even today, just a few minutes ago, I was having an email conversation with a chap. We're talking about playing drums. And I'm starting to think, how could we use solution-focused approach to not only help someone to be a good drummer, but he was talking in terms of building a sense of community and having good relationships with people and playing in bands or in church groups or wherever the places that he was playing. So how do we use solution-focused conversations to focus on, hey, I want this thing to be better. I want my relationships to be better. I want to be a better person. I want to move to a better place. I want to have better opportunities. And so using good quality, positive, future-focused conversations to help someone to get there.
Yeah, I remember I saw a quote yesterday or the day before by, someone was talking about appreciative inquiry, and there was a quote that says something like, we live in the world that our questions create. And so if that's true, then better questions will give us a better world. And so I think, there's not much that can be excluded from that.
Were there ever any moments for either of you where the solution-focused approach just didn't feel like it was working?
Probably at the beginning when I was not very good at it. It wasn't that, it was the user, not the model. I wasn't very good at it. I wasn't confident. And so I think the times when I think it isn't working, I just reminded myself, it's because you don't know how to do it properly yet, and you just aren't trusting it enough. And so I think since I've got more used to it, and since it's become my really only way of operating it, I haven't had that experience again. But certainly at the beginning, when I was choosing to transition from my old way of working and being with people to the new way, it was a little bit disjointed maybe at times, because I was just playing with parts of it. But over time, I think I've seen too many examples of people do amazing things and move forward in their lives through some really difficult, supposedly hopeless situations to feel like there is anything that haven't had that experience again where I feel like, oh, it's not working, I've got to go back to CBT, or I've got to pull something else out of the bag. That just hasn't happened.
Well, that's a hard question, I think. I didn't really expect that question. But I'd say I'm a bit of a realist about it. As much as I love the approach and promote the approach, and I think everyone should be using the approach, I'm a realist. I'll say maybe the approach doesn't fit for every client in every scenario, and that's fine. But I think that it's an ideal place to start, because let's imagine that the solution-focused approach worked for 50% of the clients that I saw. I'd be pretty happy with that. You know, I could do something in a single session or in just a couple of sessions with someone. It helps them to start to move in the direction that they want to move into. I'm happy with that. And then if there's 50% of people that it doesn't work for, at least it's been a really positive conversation. At least it's been a future-focused conversation. At least it's been a conversation with someone who is hopeful for you. You know, it ticks all the right boxes for being the first session. Okay, at least they've started being pointed in the right direction.
It's interesting, even the question about, and I can't remember how you worded it, Joe, but around where it wouldn't work. Are there places that solution focus wouldn't work? And I think as you were talking, David, I was thinking about how we define success and how we determine whether it's worked or not, and made me think about the work I did in custody a year or so ago, and how people always wanted to know, well, what were your success stories? What were the really good successes that you had? And so everyone wants to hear the big stories of people going from one end of the scale to the other, or doing big transformational changes in their life. And that's really cool. I mean, we all like talking up the big stories, right, of massive changes. But for me, I think that piece of work really changed my definition of what worked or what was helpful, because as particularly in the early parts of that project, it was pretty much single session therapy, because it was only a pilot, and so it was only a one-off conversation. But what I thought after doing that was that even if I didn't even know what happened for that person after that conversation, for me, the fact that that person was given attention, they were given the space to have a conversation, they were treated with respect and empathy and shown interest from somebody who actually saw them as a person and not just an offender or someone who'd done something particular that had landed them in custody. That's a success, that person got to experience a different way of being treated. So what they do with that conversation, we can't control, but I could control the fact that I made that person feel like they had value and they had potential to have a better life.
If you had to come up with an advertising campaign for solution-focused brief therapy, what would your slogan be?
Oh, David, we joke about this, right? And I think the Muppets had the best ever slogan for the Muppets Lab, like the Bunsen, was it Dr. Bunsen and Beaker? They had the slogan, what is it, David, that where the future is being created today? Was that it, David?
Yeah, the future is being made today.
Oh, we found it because when we started our kind of joint venture, we because it's the Possibilities Lab, and because I had this thing about a lab, and then I thought about the Muppets, and clearly anyone who knows the Muppets knows that David would be the sensible Dr. Bunsen and I'd be the raving lunatic Beaker, but who gets blown up all the time, but it's okay. And so we found that slogan that they had, and we thought, oh, wow, how perfect. We're not using the slogan, obviously, because it's probably copyright, but it was like, wow, how perfect. What a great, I don't remember it from watching the Muppets, and I was a diehard Muppet fan. I don't remember ever seeing that slogan, but I like it.
So I had another one where a few years ago I was thinking, if I ever had a business, what would I call it? And I came up with the idea of Left Turn Solutions, and that's the name of my business. And where that came from was, you know, we say in solution-focused approaches, if it's working, you keep doing it. If it's not working, you do something different. And I was playing around with that, and I thought, well, if it's going right, great. If it's not going right, then maybe go left. And so I came up with the slogan of, if things aren't going right, go left.
You two have done these before. I've seen some of the interviews that you've given before. What am I missing? What am I leaving out? What would you like to add?
Do you want to talk about how we started doing our joint stuff, David?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Oh. Well, you came to New Zealand, and Michael, because we both knew Michael Durant. So Michael was the first person I did any training with when he came to Hawke's Bay in 2011, and I think he talked about this David person in Australia, and Michael thought really, really highly of David. And I think, David, it was when you came over, I can't remember what year, was it maybe 2017 or something like that? You came to New Zealand, and so Michael just connected us, I think, and we had a coffee.
Yeah, 2017, it was just passing through Napier, and Michael, just on a holiday, and Michael said, "Oh, why don't you look up Emma and catch up with her?" So we had a coffee together, had a chat. That was all good. In 2019, I went back to New Zealand and spent a year there on a working holiday. And as part of that, we had our association conference in Christchurch that year, in November of that year. And we were trying to build a program, and we came up with an idea of having some open sessions in the evening where we could just invite the public to for free sessions of something. And so Emma and I decided we'd host a workshop on suicide prevention, and we opened it up to the public. And there was a full room there. There was 80-something people, 80 or 90 people turned up to the event. And we talked about how to use the solution-focused approach when you either with suicide prevention or when you're talking with someone who's having suicidal thoughts. And that was about a 2-hour workshop. It seemed to go really well. We didn't practice it much before. We had worked out our sort of agenda and some slides and things, but while we were standing there doing the workshop, we seemed to work well together. Emma would say a little bit, and then I would say a little bit, and then Emma would say a little bit, and I think, why didn't I say that? Because she said it so much better than what I could say it. And we tended to fill in the gaps for the other people. And at the end of it, I thought, it seemed to go so well that I thought we should maybe do more of that. But since then, we've done a few online trainings. We did an event in Mexico and a couple in the UK, and one in Australia, and it seemed to be going really, really well. So we thought, let's just do a bit more. It's really, and I think Emma would say the same thing, whenever we're hanging out with people who love the solution-focused approach and are really passionate about it, we get inspired by it. So we hang out with each other, and we hang out with other good people around us, and we encourage and inspire each other. And I think that's where we do our best work.
We're just talking about doing more together under that Possibilities Lab banner, which is just really our joint, what we do, our joint work under. But we have talked about, how we could collaborate more with other people like Sophie, who David's mentioned already, and Jason Pascoe in Australia as well, just to, it's always cool to spend time, like David said, hanging out with people who are really enthusiastic about the approach, but then also thinking about, well, how could we work together more and, team up with other people to bounce off each other and, learn from each other and keep each other's tank topped up with energy and enthusiasm and inspiration. My work and my main job at the moment, a lot of what I teach it's not in your face solution focused. It is solution focused, but it's not that I'm trying to hide it or do anything sneaky, but it's just about how do you equip people with the skills and the tools, and also when I do work with the public, they don't need to know that they're learning the solution focused approach. They just want, what do I do? What do I say if I'm concerned about someone? And so while they are being taught solution focused, I don't think everything has to be under the banner of, I'm going to now teach you the solution focused approach. And so in my private work, I use a framework called HELP, HELP, which is partly because of where I work at the moment. So the H is for how am I, which is just looking at getting myself into the right headspace even before I have an engagement with the person, and how am I going to ensure that they get the best from me, and thinking kind of planning, I suppose, for that conversation. And then the E is the engagement. So teaching people about how you engage, how you build that relationship, how you start to form that. And then the L and the P are probably the more, I suppose, explicit solution focused, whereas L is listening with curiosity. So teaching people to how we be curious, how we go in looking for or listening for strengths and hopes and aspirations and knowledge and exceptions and stuff. And then the P is partnering for solutions. So and the reason I called it that was because to help people to move away from that, I'm going to tell you what I think you should do. It's about how do we partner together with the other person to come up with a plan that that person wants or is going to be suited for them. And so I've found that's landed quite well with different organisations I've worked with, because it's solution focused without being, and all the techniques and the skills are in there still, but it gives people a different kind of model. And because often the people that I'm working with are people who joined the organisation to help people. So HELP is a really easy acronym for them to remember. Yeah.
I think that, Emma and I have a lot of this in common. We want to have normal conversations with normal people to help them to do normal things, really. And I think one thing we have in common is that we don't like being called psychotherapists. I don't even like being called a counsellor. I'm just, and that goes back to the start of the session today. How do you want to be introduced? Well, I'm David, I'm not David the psychotherapist. It just doesn't fit well with me. And I don't know if that's a personal thing or it's part of my nursing background or what it is. But, Emma mentioned covert, solution focused. So having a normal sounding conversation without the jargon or the psychobabble or the big words or whatever, and almost the person you're talking to wouldn't even know that you're having a therapy session. And that goes back to something I learned in high school a long time ago. There was we had a guest come to our English class. He was an Australian writer and storyteller. And he used to, just go to places and tell stories. And he said one of the keys that he did when he was doing a performance or a storytelling thing, he said one of his aims was to get halfway into the story before people realized he was actually telling a story. And I kind of feel that with my solution-focused approach. If I get halfway into a therapy session before somebody realizes that I'm actually doing a therapy session, I think that's a pretty good way to start. And the basics are there. The foundation's been laid before they even know what we're actually doing. I remember, Emma, when we went to Christchurch and we were at we were running our conference in Christchurch, and we took the whole conference to a barbershop. And the activity was that in the barbershop, we had the barber there, and he was cutting someone's hair. And we were the voice of the barber. We had to stand behind him with the microphone. We were interviewing the client while they're having a haircut. And how do you do a counselling session in a normal place like a barbershop? And it was funny that a lot of people couldn't do it because they were going straight to techniques and they were going to language. And I'm thinking, can't you just have a conversation with that person? Have a normal conversation with that person using your solution-focused belief, your stance, but not the jargon or the techniques, because ultimately you still want to do the same thing. But it's really hard for some people. But I think it makes a big difference when it comes to an outcome that a person feels like they've had a normal conversation with a normal person. They haven't just been to their therapist.
But I really needed to retrain how I looked at things and follow a structure before I could do exactly what you're saying, David. How long did it take you to be able to shift into being able to just flow with it?
So I think for me it was, this is going to sound really weird, but it felt like coming home. It felt like I was just now able to do what I'd always wanted to do, but felt like I wasn't allowed. For me, it was just liberating to be able to talk to people normally. And while it probably took me a while to become comfortable asking the miracle question, because I thought, well, that's really weird. I'm not going to ask anybody that. And so it took me a while to, I suppose, feel comfortable in weaving those questions in without sounding really disjointed and kind of strange. But I think the mindset and the lens of how we see people and how we look at people and what we listen for, and how being impressed by people and inspired by the people that we're helping was the easy part.
Yeah, I think the lens part of it was natural for me, but the conversation part of it wasn't, and I'd never learnt therapy as such. And so I started at a very awkward way. I wasn't seeing 5 clients a day, 5 days a week. It was very ad hoc kind of interactions that I was having. I wasn't doing it all the time, but it was very awkward. I was trying to learn about things like best hopes and common projects. So all of my questions were about that. And then sometime next, I was trying to learn about exceptions. So all of my questions were about exceptions. And then I was trying to learn about miracle questions. So I started asking that a few times. And then I was trying to learn about scaling. I was trying to ask that a few times. It took a long time before I could piece it together and make a session. But then it still felt, it was okay. It was great. I was learning it, but it was still a little bit awkward. But now, if I look at myself, I'll go through a whole session with someone and I might not ask the miracle question or a scaling question or any typical type questions in a session. And yet I can reflect on it and thinking that was the perfect solution focused session. But what made it perfect? It was more about the natural conversation that we've had using the core principles of the approach. What does the person want? What does the future hold for them? You know, their preferred future and their strengths and their resources that are going to help them to get there. And that was our conversation.
One thing I like about the solution focused world is that everybody is so open-minded, seemingly. Maybe not. At least they come across as open-minded. They don't openly judge, at least to the best of my knowledge so far. I keep kicking around what is most comfortable for me so I can be genuine and follow it. And what I find myself doing the most, at least for the past 2 years, how I start depends on how I already know the person. If I don't know the person well at all, I'll start with, or if it's like a meeting, like a group meeting, I find it most constructive for me to start with what are our best hopes for today, for how will we know this has been useful. But if I already know the person well, or it's a follow-up session, I'll always start with what's been better since I last saw you, and then I'll go best hopes, and then we'll cycle through. But for me, maybe I'm too rigid. I don't know, because I need a, like, I find myself getting trapped in problem-focused talk if I don't start with one of those two, and I work with a lot of negative people. I'm also a pacifist with a bad temper, and that if someone's throwing stuff at me, I'll like, it doesn't even have to be at me. If they're throwing out negative stuff, I'll find myself catching it and throwing it back, and I can only break that cycle if I do one of those two. So I can only be the person I need to be at work if I start with one of those two, and then I can follow and flow. But if I don't start with one of those two, I feel like I'm an ass sometimes. I'm just like, this isn't who I need to be right now. Did you?
You're right. You're right, Joe, because I used to think sometimes, like working in a hospital and working under a medical model, it was quite rigid in the approach that we had to do and the tools we had to use and things. But sometimes I had to literally think to myself, I'm going to take this hat off and I'm going to put that hat on. I'm not going to go in there with that medical model assessment thing to please the psychiatrist. I'm going to put my solution focus hat on to try and please my clients. And I literally had to stop outside of the room and think to myself, I'm putting this hat on now. And I think that's the problem when I go into my son's bedroom. I forget to put that hat on. And so I see the rubbish on the floor and the mess and the smell, and that's when I lose it. But going into a session for me is the same. Sometimes I have to stop. I still stop outside of the room, and I don't have to take a deep breath because I'm anxious or anything, but I just take a deep breath and think to myself, I'm going to do this now. Now, it's not my agenda in that respect. I'm not going to dictate the conversation and things, but my agenda is make this person, feel better about something so that they leave the room feeling better and that they've got a really clear vision for what they want in the future. And if I go into the room with that and I start the conversation with that, like you say, what are your best hopes for the meeting or for this session? Then we've got a starting point where we're facing in the right direction. And once we've got that, it flows a lot better.
You just made me feel so much better. Thank you, David. Because Emma, do you have to check yourself, or does it just always flow?
I think the thing I have to check myself with, and it's probably more when I use it in my family life actually than at work, is I think what stood out for me in the last few weeks when things have been rocky for the kids has been that reminding myself that what I would need in a situation isn't necessarily what someone else would need. And so for me, the adjustment is if someone's going through something that I've experienced to at least a similar degree, and I can remember, well, I know what I needed is ABC, to be comfortable with ABC really not being what they want and them wanting DEF and going with that, because I think for me that's the bit that I have to really work on, because to not project, but I think you would need this because that's what I needed, and be open to them wanting something really different. And I suppose it's different when it's, someone that is personally really important to you. It's different from a client who you don't know well, because you're invested in the outcome for them and you want them to be happy and healthy and well and all that stuff. And so it's partly it's not imposing what I think the solution is on them, but also remembering that this is about them and I've got to manage myself and my own anxiety or part in the situation so that I can be helpful for them. And so separating that out, which is a kind of a different dynamic, I suppose, when it's something that is in your personal life rather than in your work life, which you can be a bit more detached from. But it's a good lesson, right? And sometimes the best lessons we get are in our own life, not necessarily at the office. So you never stop learning. And I think every conversation you have, whoever that's with or whatever it is, it's an opportunity to see something differently or adjust your thinking or learn and grow a bit more.
It's funny, coupling together what you two just said. I don't remember exactly what your acronym HELP stood for, but thinking about what David was saying about changing the hat, I was piecing together my own version of HELP. And I mean, it's okay. How do you feel right now? Because if you don't self-check, you can't change the hat. And then evaluate. How do you feel? Listen, and then proceed. And if you remember that you're there to help, you can do that.
Yeah.
But if you go in, so I think I've just modified your acronym for my own use.
Go for it. It's I think that's, for me, it's about the how, because an interaction is two people, right? And so it starts with me and my self-awareness and getting myself into the right space, whatever that involves. And then when you start that interaction with someone, that's when it's sort of like, how am I, how are you, how are they, and then how are we together? So it's kind of that bringing together of me as an individual, them as an individual, and then what we create between us.
If you find this interesting and haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe, like, or share this site, and hit that little bell button to get notifications as well.